Most people think the word sandwich was born in a gambling hall. A bored English noble, a deck of cards, and a slab of meat squeezed between two slices of bread. It sounds perfectly reasonable, like something you tell in a pub, while chewing on a modern descendant of that very invention. But the truth behind a word sandwich, and the story of how it became one of the most universal foods on Earth, is far more surprising, much older, and much more human than the simple gambling story we're used to hearing. To understand how the word sandwich came to be, you need to forget England for a moment. You need to forget the aristocracy, forget the Earl, forget the playing cards. Because long before anyone ever uttered the word sandwich, people all across the ancient world were already eating, well, sandwiches. They just didn't call them that. Ancient Jews ate something very similar during Passover. Pieces of herb and meat pressed between matzah bread, known as the Hillel sandwich, named after a rabbi who lived more than 1,000 years before the Earl of Sandwich. The ancient Greeks used flatbread to wrap meats, vegetables, and sauces. Medieval European peasants placed their food on thick slices of stale bread, called trenchers, which acted both as plate and meal. In other words, humanity has been putting food inside bread for thousands of years. The Earl of Sandwich didn't invent the idea. He just accidentally branded it. So if he didn't invent it, why do we call it by his name? Why did a single man end up shaping the vocabulary of the entire world? And why did that word spread to every continent, every language, and every culture, sometimes without even being translated? The answer is a perfect example of how history, language, fame, and even early media can collide in unexpected ways. Let's go back to the 18th century. John Montagu, the fourth Earl of Sandwich, wasn't exactly the most beloved figure in British politics. He was powerful, yes, First Lord of the Admiralty, friend to the aristocracy, frequently involved in major political decisions. But he was also controversial, accused of corruption, and, at times, mocked in the press. But one thing about him stood out. He was famous. He was the kind of person newspapers loved to write about. His name appeared often, sometimes in flattering stories, sometimes in brutal satire. And that constant public presence ended up doing something he never intended, turning his name into a food category. Here's the thing. The Earl did sometimes order meat between two pieces of bread, but probably not because he was obsessed with gambling. Historians think the gambling rumor came later, mostly from people who disliked him and wanted a funny anecdote to attach to his reputation. The more likely reason for his unusual meal was simple practicality. He worked long hours at his desk and needed a way to eat without using utensils or stopping what he was doing. Bread kept his hands clean. It kept papers clean, and it allowed him to keep working without pausing for a full meal. That's it. No dramatic card table, no addiction to gambling. Just a busy man trying to multitask. But here's where the story takes a turn. People around him began noticing the habit. Wealthy men in his social circle copied it. Servants, when asked to prepare the same meal, naturally referred to it as the sandwich because it was his usual request. And once it entered spoken language, it only needed one more thing to push it into permanent cultural memory, a mention in print. That came in 1762, when a London society newspaper described a man who ordered a sandwich, referring not to the Earl, but to the specific combination of meat and bread. That tiny line in a small publication is the first known use of the word sandwich in print. And once something enters print, it begins to spread. Other newspapers picked it up, other aristocrats adopted it, and the name started to appear in menus, letters, diaries, and even satirical poems. In a matter of years, sandwich went from a private habit of one nobleman to a fashionable trend across London. But the real explosion happened with the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, millions of workers needed cheap, portable meals they could eat quickly during short breaks. The sandwich was perfect, fast, convenient, no utensils required, and endlessly customizable. Bakeries sold them. Street vendors sold them. Families made them. And because the name had already been popularized in London's press and social circles, the word sandwich spread right along with the food itself. From there, the journey of the sandwich became global. In America, it fit perfectly into the culture of diners and lunch counters. In France, it influenced the development of the baguette sandwich. In Italy, it merged with local traditions and eventually contributed to the modern panino. Across Asia, the concept mixed with existing street foods, from Japanese katsu sandwiches to Hong Kong-style milk bread sandwiches. Everywhere it traveled, the sandwich adapted, evolved, and blended with local ingredients and tastes, but the word itself stayed surprisingly intact. Here's a fascinating detail. Languages often localize foreign food names, but sandwich frequently remains sandwich or something extremely close to it. In Spanish, it's sandwich. In German, sandwich. In Arabic, sandwich. In Japanese, sando. The word became so universal that it barely needed translating. It's one of the few English words that has truly gone global without losing its identity. And that's a testament not to the Earl's culinary genius, but to the combined force of media, social imitation, and cultural timing. But the story gets even more interesting when you look at the Earl himself. John Montagu wasn't thrilled, or even aware, that his name was becoming attached to a food item. He didn't promote it. He didn't claim it. He didn't try to brand or control it. In fact, he probably would have been surprised to know that this tiny personal habit would outlive every political achievement of his career. People don't remember him for his military reforms or his political influence. They remember him because they use his name every time they grab a quick lunch. And there's something almost poetic about that. A powerful politician, a member of the elite, worried about his legacy, ends up being immortalized not for any grand decision, but for the most ordinary thing imaginable. A piece of bread with something inside it. A meal so simple that billions of people eat it every week. A meal so universal that it crosses borders, languages, and cultures. A meal people customize endlessly without ever thinking about the man supposedly responsible for its name. But perhaps that's the secret behind the story. The sandwich wasn't invented. It was noticed. It was named. And it became part of the global vocabulary because it was practical, relatable, and easy to replicate. People didn't adopt it because of the Earl. They adopted it because it made sense. And once a newspaper gave it a name, the rest of the world simply followed along. So the next time you make a sandwich, whether it's a simple ham and cheese or something extravagant, remember this. You're not eating a nobleman's invention. You're eating the descendant of 1,000 ancient meals, shaped by cultures across centuries, carried by human habit, refined by workers and travelers and families, and named, almost accidentally, after a man who never imagined he'd be remembered every time someone got hungry. And maybe that's the most surprising part of all. The story of the word sandwich isn't about invention. It's about how everyday things become global, not through brilliance, but through coincidence, repetition, and the quiet power of a name catching on at exactly the right moment.